by a bent line, by a straight line, by a crooked line. The Crooked Path, a podcast for modern cunning folk with Peter Pagan.
Hello and welcome to The Crooked Path. My name is Peter Pagan, and this week we're going to take a look at some of the different quarter systems that various witchcraft traditions use. But first, here's a little bit of news. And the first piece of news is that it's not guaranteed yet, but it looks like I may be going to Chicago. It's a wonderful town. In September, mid-September, I should hopefully be there the second weekend of September for the Pagan Podcast Super Moot, where a whole bunch of pagan podcasters will be milling around like crazy people and getting up to mischief, and will all also be turning up at Chicago's Pagan Pride. And on the Saturday I'll be teaching a workshop in one of the stores in Chicago, Cleo's, and on the Sunday I'll be teaching a workshop at Pagan Pride. So assuming all the final details get finalised, if you're in the Chicago area or close enough to get there that particular weekend, then I'd steer clear, because otherwise you might bump into me. Other news of interest, let me see. The weekend before that, we're organising a weekend intensive where I'll be teaching all kinds of witchy stuff in North Carolina, in New Bern. And if you go to my Facebook page, you should find a link to the event there, or you can do a search on Eternal Harvest Church of Wicca, who are hosting it, and get the information from them. And hopefully that will also be going ahead. Nothing absolutely definite yet, and there has to be enough people to cover the cost of getting me there. But if that happens, then I'll be there. I'll be there. Yeah, I better not sing anymore today. So anyway, that's almost all the news. The only other piece of news I want to add is that I've been creating these wonderful candle jars. Ta-da! And this is Black Hawk, who is a close personal friend of my wife. And at the suggestion of Mama Star Casas, I've started etching these reusable candle jars for petitioning the spirits. This particular one, as I said, is for Black Hawk, and that's his portrait on the front there. I've also done the 4 aces from the deck of cards: Ace of Spades, Ace of Clubs, Ace of Hearts, and Ace of Diamonds, which we'll use for various purposes. And Mama Star has been kind enough to write instructions on how to use them for me to send out with each jar. And you can find them on my Etsy store, which is Pendrake, just like the books, along with my my geeky gifts, my candle lanterns, and Linda's wonderful little polymer clay miniature sorcery books. So put that up there so he can look over my shoulder and whisper sweet nothings to me. And that's it for the news, really. So now it's time for me to witter on about quarters. Quarters is a very interesting thing, because most magical traditions in the West use some sort of quarter system. They work with the compass points north, south, east and west. Pardon me. And they're usually involved in setting up sacred space or casting circle. And a lot of neo-pagan groups work with the classical quarter system that was made popular in the Victorian era by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. This is where you find air in the east, fire in the south, water in the west, and earth in the north. But that's not the only way it's done. There are a lot of the pre-Wiccan or non-Wiccan witchcraft traditions work different systems, and one of the other popular quarter systems is what's known as northern quarters, which is actually the quarter system that my own tradition uses. And with this you find fire in the east, earth in the south, water in the west, and air in the north. And there's a lot of interesting discussions that go on about this particular process, because a lot of people who follow one assume that it's the only way of doing it, and there have been some very heated discussions over the years. In fact, I must confess, when I first encountered Northern Quarters back in my days as an Alexandrian high priest, when I met the Americans who eventually brought me over here to meet my wife and decide to move over here, the first thing that Dave Finnan did on meeting me was handed me a little booklet about the Roebuck tradition and the Cloud Tubal Cain. And they used Northern Quarters, and I looked through it, saw that they put all the compass directions for different elements, and thought, what a load of crap. Little was I to know that a few years later I would myself be training with the Roebuck and discovering the beauty of Northern Quarters, because it's very interesting, and there is a real difference, and you might think that it doesn't really matter, and in some respects it doesn't. The main reason for having things allocated to the quarters is to make sure you call everybody without forgetting anybody. That's always been my personal theory at the deepest level. But there are some noticeable differences. The way that you create sacred space affects the nature of the energy within it, and one of the things that a lot of people fail to take into account is that a lot of groups that work Northern Quarters don't actually work elementally. But Peter, you just said earth, air, fire and water in the quarters, and yes I did, but when you're talking Northern Quarters, you're not talking about the traditional classical Greek elements. You are, in Northern Quarters, when you talk about fire, you're talking about the reddish yellow burny stuff, and when you talk about earth, you're talking about the brown stuff that gets really goopy when it's wet, and or sometimes you're talking about stones and rocks. When you're talking about water, you're literally talking about the wet stuff you drink or swim in, or drown in if you're really unlucky. And when you're talking about air, you're talking about the stuff you breathe. So they can technically still be called elements, but they're not elements in the classical sense. They're not principles of energy in the way that they are in the classical elemental quarter system. In fact, the more important aspects of the quarters with Northern Quarters is that they represent qualities of light. And so we look at the east as sunrise, dawn. We look at the south as midday, noon. Look at the west as sunset or dusk, and north as midnight, because that's the way the day goes around the wheel. And the qualities of light are very important. And it's dawn and dusk are liminal times. They're the thresholds between day and night, and this makes them very powerful times, and that makes the ley line between east and west, that line that cuts across the sacred space, makes it very potent. And this is why it is the path of the initiate. You walk from east to west, you walk from birth to death. It's the path that you follow. It meanders, takes a crooked path, of course, but ultimately it is the most powerful ley line for the individual initiate. Whereas the north-south ley line is more to do with the path of the gods and the mysteries of deity. And of course, to complete the hex star, you then have to have it's usually from southeast to northwest is the third line, which is the path of the Sacred King. It's from Beltane to Samhain, from womb to tomb, is one way of putting it. But one of the really interesting things about not working elementally, and in order to avoid confusion with my own students, I've taken to referring to the quarter attributes as being sun, stone, sea and sky, because it alliterates nicely, and it gets away from people thinking of pentagrams and Tatvic colours and Kabbalistic stuff, which we don't use very much of in our tradition. So I try and make it clear by using the 4 S's instead. There's a couple of other things about calling quarters that tends to be a little different between Wicca and witchcraft. A lot of witchcraft traditions have guardian deities in the quarters, and this has become more popular generally in the neo-pagan movement. But originally, with the British traditional Wiccans, the Gardnerians and the Alexandrians, you actually called in the watchtowers at the quarters, and this would take one of 2 forms. You'd either call in the archangels, Raphael, Michael, Gabriel and Uriel, being very careful to pronounce his name Uriel, the archangel of the element of earth, as opposed to Oriel, who's one of the various versions of the Angel of Death. So, important safety tip there, make sure you pronounce Uriel, not Oriel. And and if you weren't calling in the archangels with the watchtowers, you were calling in the winds, Zephyrus, Erebus, Notus and Boreas, the classical Greek winds, and frequently topping them off with the elemental kings. Gob, the king of the gnomes, for the element of earth. God, I can't remember the other ones, it's been so long, but you've got the jinn in the south for fire, you've got the salamanders in the west for water, you've got the sylphs in the east for...
Undines.
Yeah, that too. Good job somebody who's paying attention.
Undines are water.
Yes. Yes, what the hell did I... No, yeah, I said salamanders, which is, of course, is the creature of fire. It should have been sylphs and undines. The sylphs are air and the undines are water. And they have a king, and I remember the king of the gnomes because his name is Gob.
Mm-hmm.
Which puts a whole new twist on the phrase gobsmacked.
Oh.
I think he is a kinky name.
Never thought about that.
Yeah. But anyway, so it gets very complicated. Whereas in traditional witchcraft, you tend to find that deities are used as the quarter guardians. There are other options as well, but I think most traditions I've encountered tend to use deities in the quarters, and that puts a different spin on things. I mean, you have to remember that classical Wicca. There's a phrase I'm calling myself, classical Wicca. That's the Alexandrian and Gardnerian Wicca that existed in the 60s and 70s. Okay, I'm coining the phrase classical Wicca for that, because that's Wicca before it got Americanized. It's before Wicca came over here in any significant way. Well, it came over here in the early 70s, I think, but it took before it became the huge phenomenon that it is now, where you've got 500 different flavors of Wicca, and the original Alexandrians and Gardnerians have kind of got lost in the mix there a bit. But classical Wicca, where Gardner and Alexanders were still running covens, tended to be, and their descendants still tend to be, duotheistic. They see divinity as consisting of a god and a goddess, and that all the gods of the pantheons of mythology are one god, and all the goddesses of the pantheon of mythology are one goddess. So you basically take the monotheism of Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and you split God into a god and a goddess. And it's not unknown for Wiccans to believe that there is a single creator, and that creator is manifest in the universe as the god and goddess. So you have the duality, which is actually the face of a singularity. Whereas traditional witches tend to be either atheist, in a strange, twisted way, or some level of hard polytheist. We tend to believe in multiple deities that don't really morph into each other. Mighty morphing deities.
Oh dear.
I know, it's a terrible thought. I need to get the bottle brush and put it between my ears now. But sometimes it seems like the differences between Wicca and witchcraft are that traditional witches tend to do stuff or call stuff different things to try and show how different they are from Wicca. A prime example is the use of the phrase warding the space or creating sacred space. A lot of traditional witches will move heaven and earth to avoid using the phrase casting circle. I've been guilty of doing that myself. I will try not to say casting circle. I can't speak for everyone else. For myself, it's because for me there is a difference between casting a Wiccan circle and warding the space in traditional craft. I mean, yeah, there's lots of old traditional names for it. There's warding the space, there's raising the hedge, there's the castle and moat, there's ploughing the bloody furrow, laying the compass, the Widdershoon's wall, all kinds of fun names. And the energy is definitely different, but they're basically doing the same basic job. They are creating an enclosure, a sacred enclosure, inside which there is no time and no space. Just an eternal now. Because witchcraft requires you to be in the now to work magic. And it's one of the big differences between witchcraft and ceremonial magic. Because ceremonial magic is much more involved up here with the intellect. And so that they tend to place themselves at the center of the universe and summon everything in the universe to them that they need to do what they want to do. Whereas in Wicca, you tend to have that similar sort of static center of the universe thing, but you tend to be a bit more supplicatory rather than summoning and demanding. I don't think Wiccans have as big an ego as ceremonial magicians. Nobody could have as big an ego as a ceremonial magician. And then your traditional crafters, what we do is we pick up the ritual space like the hem of our skirt and travel between the worlds to wherever the entity is that we want to work with. So we go to them. And that's actually one of the keys to why the corders have different attributes. Because in Wicca, with the Wiccan elemental system, you have what you have in the north defines the nature of the enclosure that you create. And so Wiccans have elemental earth in the north, which pins their circle down as a static enclosure. It is an edifice. It is a tower, a temple, a tomb. It is a static place. It's their fortress of solitude, and that's why they then have to summon everything into it. With the northern quarters, you have air in the north, and air, even if you take it as elemental air, which we don't, but air moves and is fluid, and what that means is that you have your enclosure, instead of being a building, becomes a vehicle. In being Welsh, in the tradition I follow, we tend to see it as a coracle or a boat, and we even use the symbolism of when you're entering the sacred space, the besom that is laid across the threshold is the gangplank that enables you to walk from the quayside onto the boat. And of course coracle is a nice Welsh type of boat, so we like to use coracle imagery a lot. Someone with a more New Age bent might describe the ritual space that we create as a Merkaba, or a UFO, a chariot of fire. It is a vehicle with which we travel between the worlds. We encounter the deities where they are, in their natural habitat, if you like. And this makes for a very different dynamic. It also makes our, well, for me personally, I think it makes our rituals a lot more interesting, because we're always going somewhere. You know, we don't just stand there at the centre of all and say, you know, come to me. It's like, hey, we've arrived, put the kettle on, let's have a cuppa. Much more interesting. So, you know, when we go to the underworld, we tread the mill and go down. When we go and visit the gods, we go up. When we go out and about and around. It's a very traditionally witchy thing to do, I think. And a lot of creating the ritual space in Wicca is derived from ceremonial magic. I mean, Gerald Gardner used a lot of material from the Key of Solomon in the setting up of the ritual space, which you know, it works well. Let me give you a quick demonstration. If you've not circled with Wiccans, you're not going to be overly familiar with the circle casting. So I won't demonstrate the whole setting up, but I will demonstrate the actual process of casting circle. Now, this way is, that way is east. I'm never quite sure, since I've been in America, the mountains confuse me or something. But the basic process with casting a circle in Wicca is, I conjure ye, O circle of power, that thou beest a boundary between the world of men and the realms of the mighty ones, a guardian and protection that shall preserve and contain the power that we shall raise within thee. Wherefore do I bless thee and consecrate thee in the names of the Lord and Lady. Now, it's a perfectly effective way of creating a sacred space, but it's also a very ceremonial way. I conjure ye. It treats the circle as an entity, and it's talking about barriers, a guardian and protection. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think I'm special enough or important enough that I need to be protected from a lot. I mean, yes, there are people out there who hate my guts, but I'd like to think they have more important things to do than throw crap at me on a daily basis. Maybe I'm wrong in that, I don't know, but for the average worker of magic, the only protection you need is the kind of protection you need around a campfire in the evening. Something to keep the mosquitoes off. Because the energy you raise working magic is a bit like a campfire, and it attracts the cosmic equivalent of bugs. And they're harmless, but they can be really annoying, and you need some sort of ethereal DEET to keep them away. Maybe citronella does have a magical function. Now, in traditional craft, there's a lot of different ways of creating that sacred space, but ultimately, if you need to raise sacred space in a hurry, there it is. It's up, and there it is down. You don't really need to do anything fancy, but that's the nature of the beast. A lot of Wiccan traditions have scripted rituals, and there's nothing wrong with scripted rituals, but it does tend to give the impression that there's a right way and a wrong way to do things. And yeah, there is a wrong way. If it doesn't work, you're doing it wrong. If it does work, you're doing it right for you, and that's the key. There aren't any absolutes. Just as you know, witches don't tend to follow the idea of duality very much. Dualism is a Gnostic idea. The idea of absolute good, absolute evil was brought into Christianity when they adopted various Gnostic themes in order to make themselves popular. And those Gnostic themes carried on throughout the monotheistic religions and were incorporated into groups like the Golden Dawn and Theosophy, because they were essentially still Christian people, even though they were practicing magic, and they had a huge influence upon Wicca. And Wicca, that's why Wicca has this dualistic, the Lord and Lady. Now, at least they've gotten away from the good and evil absolutes, but they're very much caught up in the polarity of male and female, and it's one of the reasons why some traditions are hung up on male-female polarity, and they find it very difficult to work nicely with people who are gay or have other gender orientations or sexualities than the obvious heterosexual male-female polarity. It really can be quite a problem for some of them. Witchcraft, however, doesn't work like that. I mean, the old saying that Cochrane was famous for saying, amongst several other sayings, was "truth lies betwixt the horns." And it's the old idea of Baphomet with the flaming torch between the horns. The idea is that it's not black and white, it's not either or, it's a sliding scale, shades of grey. And that gives you a lot more freedom. And it means you have to take a lot more responsibility as well, because you can't say, you know, I had no choice, because yes, you did. Every step of the way, so you have to take responsibility, which is a mark of being a witch anyway. So I'm going to sit back down again, so if you want, unless you want to look at the top of my head, there we go. The lovely Christopher, who's producer and cameraman tonight. And so it does make a huge difference how you create your sacred space. But to be honest, ultimately the real difference is what you do when you get there. And as long as you create an enclosure, a sacred space inside which you've done away with time and space, so you're in the now, you're in the moment, you're in that trance state, that ecstatic state where all things are possible, then that's all good. And if you do it with an I conjure ye, O so about, I mean, I used to know this girl from Aberdeen, and we used to joke about using a Scottish athame, where you pick up a beer bottle, smash it on the table, and with the jagged ends go, I conjure ye, O circle of poor. You know, that particular piece of the script has always sounded better with a Scottish accent to me. I conjure ye, O circle of poor. And it doesn't matter. You can, I mean, we have raised, you know, we've done some crazy rituals over the years. Back in the Wildwood days, when we would do public rituals at the Ravenslight store, we would do all kinds of interesting themed rituals. I mean, some people put on a Star Wars ritual, which was pretty cool. There was a caveman ritual. There was a Beatles ritual. There were all kinds of cool things. And one particular ritual, because Raven, who ran the store and was also the mistress of our coven, got fed up of every time there was a public ritual, somebody would complain about something. Sometimes it was justified. I remember one ritual where they decided to be all about equality, and you know, I'm a big fan of equality myself, but the way it manifested in this particular ritual is when it came time for the libation, they did the libation with every gender combination possible. So male, female, male, male, female, female, male to female transgendered with female to male transgender. It went on for an hour, just the libation portion. And that was a little too much. But anyway, yeah, so sometimes there was justification in the complaints, but somebody would always complain about something. And Raven got really pissed at the whole thing and said, screw this, and she put on a redneck circle. And she was dressed as Minnie Pearl, and the high priest for the evening was dressed as Johnny Cash, and he had a tool belt, and his athame was this screwdriver. They had a picnic table with a black and white checked tablecloth, and the libation was RC Cola and moon pie, and the priest cast circle to me singing Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire, and you know what? It raised perfectly good energy.
And nobody complained?
And nobody complained. That was the really fun thing. There was not a single complaint that night.
My goodness.
But anyway, so I just wanted to share a little bit about some of the differences and just point out that what really matters, it's not what you do, how you get there, it's what you do when you've arrived. It's the magic you do in your sacred space. Whatever you do that gets you into that sacred space, into that moment, is valid. If it works for you and it's neither illegal nor doing damage to another living creature, then have at it. And then do something awesome once you're there. Because magic is, it's always been my crusade for several years now to point out that magic isn't just psychology. It isn't just feel good, be at one with the universe. You can actually do things, practical things with magic. And don't put limits on yourself. The only limits you have magically are the limits you set yourself by believing that it's not possible. If you can imagine it, you can do it. You've just got to figure out how to get from here to there. And that's part of the journey, and that's where the fun lies. So with that thought, I'm going to let you all go and go off and go about your business. Hopefully I've given you some food for thought, and if I haven't done that, hopefully at least I've entertained you and made you chuckle a bit, which is my other big plan for world domination. So take care, have a good week, and I'll see you next time.
By a bench line, by a straight line, by a crooked line. The Crooked Path, a podcast for modern cunning folk with Pagan.